On a quiet summer morning in 1859, a single gunshot echoed across a small island in the Pacific Northwest. It wasn't fired on a battlefield. There were no marching armies, no naval bombardments, no generals shouting commands, just one farmer, one animal, and one decision that would trigger one of the most extraordinary international crises in American history. Within days, armed soldiers would arrive. Within weeks, warships would appear on the horizon. Before long, two of the world's most powerful nations would stand face to face, weapons loaded, waiting for the first shot. For a brief moment, it seemed almost impossible that the United States and the British Empire could avoid another war. And the strangest part? Neither government had planned for any of it. Because everything began with something so ordinary that almost nobody could have imagined the consequences. This is the incredible true story of the Pig War, a conflict that nearly changed the course of North American history, without anyone intending to start it. To understand how a single incident could push two nations toward war, we first need to travel to a place that, in the middle of the 19th century, few people outside the region had ever heard of: the San Juan Islands. Today, they are known for peaceful harbors, forests, wildlife, and quiet coastal towns. But in 1859, these beautiful islands sat directly in the middle of one of the most dangerous diplomatic mistakes ever made. Years earlier, the United States and Great Britain had signed the Oregon Treaty of 1846. On paper, the agreement seemed simple. The border between American and British territory would follow the 49th parallel until it reached the Pacific Ocean. Then it would continue through the middle of the channel that separated Vancouver Island from the mainland. Those words looked perfectly reasonable. Until someone asked a very simple question. Which channel? There wasn't just one. There were two major waterways leading to the Pacific. One route placed the San Juan Islands inside the United States. The other placed them inside British territory. The treaty never clarified which channel its authors intended. What appeared to be a minor oversight on paper created a massive problem in reality. Both governments believed they were right. Neither wanted to surrender valuable territory, and neither wanted to appear weak. For years, the disagreement remained mostly theoretical. Maps disagreed. Diplomats exchanged letters. Officials debated interpretations. But almost nobody lived on the islands. Without settlers, there was little reason for either side to force the issue. That would soon change. As the 1850s progressed, American pioneers began moving west in growing numbers. The idea of manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was destined to stretch from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific, was influencing politics, migration, and public opinion. Every new settlement represented more than families looking for land. It represented American presence, American law, American influence. Meanwhile, the British Empire had no intention of abandoning its own interests. Through the powerful Hudson's Bay Company, Britain had already established profitable operations throughout the Pacific Northwest. The company wasn't simply a fur trading business. It functioned almost like a government. It owned land, managed farms, directed commerce, maintained relationships with indigenous communities, and supplied British authority throughout the region. One of its most valuable agricultural operations was established on the southern end of San Juan Island, Bellevue Sheep Farm. Thousands of sheep grazed across rolling green fields overlooking the sea. The farm supplied wool, meat, and food for British settlements throughout the Pacific coast. To London, it represented legitimate British enterprise. To many Americans, it looked like quiet occupation. Neither side wanted violence, but each new cabin, each fence, each crop planted on the islands strengthened someone's claim. Without realizing it, ordinary settlers were becoming pieces in an international chess match. Every harvest mattered. Every property line mattered. Every new arrival mattered. The islands themselves had become far more valuable than anyone had expected. Not because of gold, not because of oil, but because whoever controlled them controlled an important gateway between the Pacific Ocean and the inland waters of the Northwest. Military officers understood the strategic importance immediately. Politicians did too. The public, however, remained largely unaware. Few newspapers paid much attention to an obscure island dispute thousands of miles from Washington. For most Americans, life simply went on. No one imagined that history was quietly moving toward a breaking point. And when that moment finally arrived, it didn't come from a politician, or a soldier, or a diplomat. It came from a hungry animal wandering through a garden. The shot that shook two empires. By the summer of 1859, life on San Juan Island had settled into an uneasy routine. American settlers cleared forests, built cabins, planted crops, and tried to establish permanent homes. Across the island, British employees of the Hudson's Bay Company managed thousands of sheep, maintained pastures, and continued their daily work, as if the question of sovereignty had already been settled. They lived side by side. Sometimes they traded, sometimes they argued. Most of the time, they simply ignored one another. Everyone understood that the political situation was unresolved, but few believed it would ever erupt into violence. Then came June 15, 1859. It began like any other day. One American farmer, Lyman Cutler, stepped outside to inspect his garden. Growing food on the island wasn't easy. Every crop mattered. Potatoes, in particular, were more than just a meal. They were a lifeline. A ruined harvest could mean months of hardship for a frontier family. As Cutler approached his patch of potatoes, he saw a familiar intruder, a large black pig. It wasn't the first time. According to Cutler, the animal had wandered into his garden several times before, rooting through the soil and devouring his crops. He had complained about it, but nothing had changed. The pig always came back. To Cutler, this wasn't simply an annoyance anymore. It was costing him food, money, time, patience. Standing in the middle of his damaged garden, he made a decision that would echo far beyond the island. He raised his rifle, he aimed, and he fired. The pig collapsed where it stood. At first, it seemed like nothing more than another frontier dispute. Farm animals wandered, neighbors argued, compensation was negotiated, life moved on. Except this time, the pig belonged to someone very important. Its owner was Charles Griffin, an Irishman employed by the Hudson's Bay Company, and the man responsible for overseeing the vast Bellevue sheep farm. To Griffin, the dead pig wasn't simply livestock, it was private property. And, more importantly, it had been killed by an American settler on land the British considered their own. When Griffin confronted Cutler, the conversation quickly turned hostile. Cutler admitted shooting the animal, but he insisted he had every right to protect his crops. Griffin demanded compensation. Cutler reportedly offered $10. Griffin refused. He wanted $100. To Cutler, the demand was outrageous. The argument hardened. Neither man backed down. Neither realized they were no longer arguing about a pig. They were arguing about sovereignty. Who had the authority to enforce the law? Who owned the island? Who decided what justice looked like? Those questions had no simple answers, and that was exactly the problem. News of the incident spread quickly among both communities. American settlers feared that British authorities would arrest Cutler. Many believed he would be taken away and tried under British law. That possibility terrified them. If Britain could arrest an American farmer on San Juan Island, what did that say about ownership of the territory? To many settlers, accepting Griffin's demands meant accepting British rule. The dead pig was becoming a symbol, not because of its value, but because of what it represented. Word soon reached Brigadier General William S. Harney, commander of the U.S. Army's Department of Oregon. Harney was no stranger to confrontation. A veteran officer with a reputation for being bold and sometimes reckless, he had long believed the United States should take a firmer stance against British claims in the Pacific Northwest. To him, the incident on San Juan Island was more than a disagreement between neighbors. It was an opportunity. If American citizens were being threatened, the Army had a duty to protect them. Or so Harney believed. Without waiting for Washington to negotiate a diplomatic solution, he made a decision that would dramatically raise the stakes. He ordered U.S. troops to occupy San Juan Island, not a handful of soldiers, an organized military force. On July 27, 1859, Captain George Pickett landed on the island with 66 American soldiers. The same George Pickett who just 4 years later would become famous during the Civil War for leading the disastrous assault remembered today as Pickett's Charge at Gettysburg. His orders were clear: protect the American settlers, prevent any British landing, hold the island. As the soldiers established their camp overlooking Griffin Bay, they dug defensive positions, raised the American flag, and prepared for whatever might come next. For the settlers, the arrival of the Army brought reassurance. For the British, it looked dangerously close to an invasion. The island was no longer home to farmers arguing over fences and livestock. It had become a military outpost. Across the water, British officials watched the developments with growing alarm. Reports reached naval commanders stationed nearby. They could not simply ignore armed American troops occupying territory. Britain claimed as its own. Soon, sails appeared on the horizon. Warships were coming. And for the first time since the War of 1812, the United States and Great Britain stood on the edge of open conflict. Standing on the edge of war. The arrival of American troops on San Juan Island sent shockwaves through British military headquarters. From their perspective, this wasn't a defensive move, it was an occupation, and occupations demanded a response. Within days, dark silhouettes began to appear beyond the morning mist. One by one, British warships entered the waters surrounding the island. Their sails caught the wind as they slowly took position offshore. To the American soldiers watching from the shoreline, the message was unmistakable. The British Navy had arrived. These were not merchant vessels. They were ships built for war. Their broadside cannons faced the coast, their crews trained and ready, their officers waiting for orders that everyone hoped would never come. On the island, Captain George Pickett studied the growing British presence with concern. His force was small, barely enough men to defend their position if fighting broke out. Yet he showed no intention of leaving. Instead, he ordered his soldiers to strengthen their camp. More trenches were dug, more defensive positions were prepared. Sentries watched the coastline day and night. Every movement on the water was carefully observed. The atmosphere grew heavier with each passing day. Neither side wanted to fire first, but both sides were preparing for the possibility. As news traveled across the Pacific Northwest, military commanders requested reinforcements. Washington had not declared war. London had not declared war. Yet military decisions were now unfolding faster than diplomatic messages could cross the continent or the Atlantic Ocean. The distance between governments created a dangerous vacuum. Local commanders were making choices that could reshape international history. British Governor James Douglas believed the Americans had gone too far. To him, allowing U.S. troops to remain on the island would weaken Britain's claim forever. He urged a firm response. British naval officers assembled an increasingly powerful fleet. Eventually, several warships surrounded the island. Hundreds of Royal Marines stood ready aboard their vessels. Their officers knew they possessed overwhelming firepower. If ordered to attack, they could likely overwhelm the small American force in a matter of hours. But victory came with a terrible risk. The first shots fired on San Juan Island would not remain there. They would echo all the way to Washington, to London, to Ottawa, to every newspaper on both sides of the Atlantic. One exchange of gunfire could ignite another Anglo-American war. Neither nation wanted that. The memory of the War of 1812 was still alive. Its scars had not completely faded. Another conflict between the United States and the British Empire would be costly, unpredictable, and politically disastrous. Yet on San Juan Island, soldiers had little control over diplomacy. They could only follow orders. More American reinforcements soon arrived. The small detachment commanded by Pickett gradually grew into a much larger force. Artillery pieces were unloaded, supplies were stockpiled. Military engineers improved the camp. What had started as 66 soldiers was becoming a fortified American position. The British answered with even greater strength. Their fleet expanded. More ships entered the surrounding waters. Observers estimated that thousands of British sailors and Marines were now within striking distance of the island. The balance of power was unmistakable. At sea, Britain held the advantage. On land, the Americans refused to retreat. Every sunrise looked like it could be the day the shooting started. Imagine standing on that shoreline. You wake before dawn. A thick layer of fog hangs over the water. As the mist begins to lift, enormous warships slowly emerge from the silence. Cannons line their sides, flags ripple in the wind. Across the beach, soldiers tighten their belts, clean their rifles, and wait. Nobody knows what will happen next. Nobody knows who might pull the trigger. The silence itself becomes terrifying. One frightened sentry, one misunderstood order, one accidental gunshot. That was all it would take. Military history is filled with wars that began through miscalculation. This could easily have become another. Fortunately, among the officers present were men who understood exactly what was at stake. British Rear Admiral Robert L. Baines refused to rush into battle. When Governor Douglas suggested landing troops by force, Baines remained cautious. According to later accounts, he recognized the absurdity of starting a full-scale war over a disputed island, whose ownership had never been properly settled. Across the water, American commanders also exercised restraint. Their orders emphasized defense rather than provocation. Hold your ground. Do not fire unless absolutely necessary. Those instructions may have prevented catastrophe. For weeks, the two forces remained locked in a silent confrontation. They could see each other every day. They watched each other's patrols. They observed each other's camps through telescopes. Sometimes the distance separating them was measured in only a few hundred yards, close enough to see faces, close enough to recognize individuals, close enough to realize that the men on the opposite side were not so different from themselves. Many spoke the same language. Many shared similar traditions. Some had even served alongside one another years earlier. Yet political decisions made far away had placed them in opposing uniforms. The standoff continued. Days became weeks. Weeks stretched into months. The world waited. Would diplomacy arrive before disaster, or had events already moved beyond anyone's control? For the soldiers stationed on San Juan Island, the answer remained uncertain. The war that never happened. For weeks, the world waited. Across the narrow waters separating San Juan Island from Vancouver Island, the two great powers remained locked in an uneasy silence. American soldiers stood behind freshly dug earthworks. British sailors waited aboard heavily armed warships. Every sunrise brought the same question. Would today be the day the shooting began? Back in Washington, word of the growing crisis finally reached President James Buchanan. The reports were deeply troubling. Military commanders on the frontier had acted quickly, perhaps too quickly. What had started as a local dispute between two neighbors had become an international crisis involving the United States Army and the Royal Navy. Neither government had intended for events to spiral this far, but now both faced the same dilemma. Backing down could be seen as weakness. Moving forward could mean war. Diplomats immediately went to work. Messages crossed oceans. Letters passed between governments. Military officers were instructed to remain calm while political leaders searched for a solution. The challenge was enormous. Neither nation wanted to surrender its claim. Yet neither wanted to explain to its citizens why thousands of lives had been lost over a small island whose ownership was still uncertain. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed. Instead of ordering an attack, both governments agreed to reduce tensions. American forces would remain on part of the island. British forces would establish their own separate camp elsewhere. Neither side would abandon its claim. Neither side would attempt to remove the other by force. It was an unusual arrangement. Two nations, two military camps, one disputed island. For the next 12 years, American and British troops lived on San Juan Island under what became known as a joint military occupation. They patrolled different areas, raised different flags, followed different chains of command. Yet somehow they managed to avoid the conflict everyone had feared. Life settled into a strange rhythm. Soldiers drilled. Supplies arrived by ship. Officers exchanged formal visits. On occasion, men from opposing camps even met socially. Despite carrying rifles and serving rival governments, many discovered they had far more in common than anyone expected. The tension never disappeared entirely, but neither did common sense. Eventually, both countries recognized that the dispute could not remain unresolved forever. Rather than settle it through force, they agreed to something far more remarkable: international arbitration. Instead of allowing generals to decide the future of the islands, they turned to diplomacy. The responsibility fell to an unexpected figure, Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany. After reviewing the arguments presented by both governments, the Kaiser announced his decision in 1872. The boundary would follow the Haro Strait. The San Juan Islands would belong to the United States. The dispute was finally over. Not with cannon fire, not with victory parades, not with a peace treaty signed after a bloody campaign, but with a decision delivered across a negotiating table The soldiers gradually departed. The warships disappeared beyond the horizon. The camps were abandoned. Nature slowly reclaimed the trenches where frightened young men had once waited for battle. Today, visitors walking across San Juan Island find peaceful forests, quiet shorelines, grazing fields, and historic landmarks. It is difficult to imagine that this tranquil landscape once stood at the center of one of the most dangerous diplomatic confrontations in North American history. The story has become known simply as the Pig War. At first glance, the name sounds almost comical. It invites laughter. It sounds like one of those strange footnotes hidden deep inside history books. But that reputation hides a much more important truth. The Pig War was never really about a pig. It was about pride, about borders drawn carelessly across maps, about political ambition, about military officers making decisions before diplomats could intervene. Most of all, it was about how easily ordinary moments can grow into extraordinary crises. History is often remembered through famous battles: Gettysburg, Waterloo, Normandy. But sometimes history is shaped just as much by the battles that never happened, the wars that were avoided, the bullets that were never fired, the orders that were never given. Had one frightened soldier opened fire? Had one naval officer acted too quickly? Had one commander chosen pride over patience? The relationship between the United States and Great Britain might have taken a very different path. Instead, both nations stepped back from the edge. And because they did, the Pig War remains one of history's greatest reminders that diplomacy is sometimes the bravest decision of all. Ironically, after months of military escalation, after fleets crossed the sea, after soldiers dug trenches, after cannons stood ready, after two powerful nations prepared for war, only one life was lost, the very one that started everything: a wandering pig looking for potatoes. Perhaps that is why this story continues to fascinate people more than a century and a half later. Not because a war was fought, but because one wasn't. Sometimes the greatest victories in history are the ones no battlefield ever records. History is full of stories that deserve to be told. The forgotten ones, the strange ones, the ones that make you stop and realize that the truth is often more extraordinary than anything we could make up. If that sounds like something you want more of, hit subscribe and ring the bell. Drop a comment below. I read them all, and I'd love to know what you think. There are a lot more stories waiting in the margins. Let's find them together. See you in the next one.